Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows, a place where the quiet strength of fathers, the unseen sacrifices, and the bittersweet truths of family life come alive through stories. If you're new here, I invite you to join our growing community. Simply click subscribe and stay with us. Every story is a reminder that respect, dignity, and love still matter. Today's tale is titled, "On my birthday, my daughter-in-law planned a trip, but left me behind." So, let us begin. Harold Benson had lived 62 birthdays in his life. Some were quiet, some were joyful, and some, like the ones when his wife was alive, were filled with laughter, chocolate cake, and the smell of candles blown out in one happy breath. But this morning, on the 63rd, he awoke to a silence that felt almost staged. The kind of silence that creeps under doors and hides in corners, waiting to be noticed. Harold lived in a modest two-story home on the edge of Willowbrook, a suburban town where neighbors waved over hedges and the mailman still whistled old country tunes. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier. Since then, his birthdays had become simpler, maybe a call from an old friend, maybe a pie from the lady across the street. But this year was different. This year, his son Matthew and daughter-in-law Clara lived with him. And Harold, though he never said it aloud, believed, hoped, that his birthday would be special again. The sun had barely risen when Harold shuffled down the hallway, his slippers whispering against the wood floor. From the kitchen came the soft clatter of dishes and Clara's unmistakable voice, brisk and sharp like a pencil scratching against paper. "And the tickets are confirmed," she was saying. "We'll leave right after breakfast. The hotel's expecting us by afternoon." Harold stopped mid-step. His heart fluttered. Tickets, hotel, afternoon. He leaned gently against the wall, not to eavesdrop, he told himself, but to steady his legs. Matthew's voice answered, softer, tired. "Are you sure we should do it today? You know what day it is." There was a pause. Then Clara's laugh, light but dismissive. "Oh, come on, it's just his birthday. He'll be fine. He doesn't even like traveling." The words fell heavy like stones in Harold's chest. He stood there, clutching the frame of the hallway, staring at the faint outline of sunlight across the carpet. A birthday, his birthday. And yet he wasn't part of the plan. Harold forced a smile when he finally stepped into the kitchen. Clara was zipping a small suitcase. Matthew, looking guilty, stirred a pot of oatmeal that smelled faintly burnt. "Morning, Dad," Matthew said, his eyes darting away. "Morning," Harold replied. His voice carried the steadiness of a man used to hiding disappointments. On the counter, he noticed a card propped up against a fruit bowl. Bright colors, bold letters, "Happy Birthday." He reached for it, hands trembling slightly. Inside, the message was polite, almost mechanical, "Wishing you a wonderful day." Matthew and Clara, no mention of dinner, no mention of plans, just ink on paper. Harold closed the card slowly as if it were fragile glass. He set it down, forcing a grin. "Thank you," he said. "That's very kind." Clara nodded briskly. "Of course." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "We left some food in the fridge in case you get hungry." Hungry, alone, on his birthday. Harold made himself tea and sat at the table. The chair across from him was empty, and he imagined Margaret sitting there, her gray hair tied back, her eyes sparkling as she teased him about growing old. He whispered softly, "Maggie, you wouldn't believe this one." The steam from his cup blurred his vision. He blinked, unsure whether it was the tea or the tears. The morning passed in fragments. Clara moved briskly through the house, giving orders, checking lists, calling friends. "Pack the sunscreen, don't forget the swimsuits, oh, and bring the charger." Harold sat in his recliner, the old leather creaking beneath him. He glanced at the small cake he had baked the night before, a simple sponge with strawberries on top. He had imagined placing it on the table that evening, candles flickering, his son and daughter-in-law singing softly before cutting the first slice. Now, the cake seemed like a guest no one had invited. At one point, Matthew sat beside him. "Dad," he began, hesitating. "About today." Harold raised a hand gently. "It's fine, son. You two go enjoy yourselves. Don't worry about me." Matthew swallowed hard. "We'll be back tomorrow." "Of course," Harold said. He patted his son's arm, but the touch carried 1,000 unspoken words. "I miss you, I need you, but I won't beg for you." By noon, the house was filled with the sound of zippers and luggage wheels against the floor. Clara checked her watch impatiently. "Let's go," she urged. "We'll be late for check-in." Matthew gave his father a quick hug, more out of duty than desire. Clara offered a polite smile, nothing more. "Bye, Dad," Matthew said. "Take care," Harold replied. His voice was steady, almost cheerful, but his eyes followed them as they walked out the door, his birthday fading with the sound of the car engine pulling away. When silence returned, it was louder than ever. Harold sat back down at the kitchen table. The card lay unopened again. The cake untouched. The house empty. He lit a single candle on the sponge cake alone. The flame flickered, fragile but stubborn, like a small heartbeat in the dark. "Happy birthday," Harold whispered to himself. He blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, vanishing into the air, like the years that had vanished before it. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains, warm and golden. The kind of light that once meant family gathered at the table, the smell of roast chicken in the oven, Margaret humming in the kitchen. But today that golden light felt cruel, almost mocking, painting the room in a cheerfulness that Harold could not feel. He drifted back toward the kitchen, his footsteps slow, measured, as if walking through heavy water. On the counter beside the fruit bowl lay the card again, its edges curled slightly, the ink still fresh. He picked it up once more, not because he needed to, but because part of him longed for something, anything he might have missed the first time. The front still smiled, bright and cheerful, "Happy birthday." Inside, the words stared back at him unchanged, "Wishing you a wonderful day." Matthew and Clara, "Wonderful day." He read it again carefully, as if reading scripture, looking for hidden meaning. But there was none. No invitation to dinner, no mention of plans together. Just a generic wish, polite as a handshake with a stranger. Harold let the card close with a faint sigh. It was not anger that filled him. Anger would have been easier to manage, but something heavier. A dull ache. The ache of being overlooked, not in a moment of busyness, but in a moment that should have been his. In the corner of the kitchen sat the small dining table. 3 chairs surrounded it. Harold's chair was closest to the window. Margaret's had once been opposite his, and the third had been added when Matthew grew old enough to join them for supper. Now, Margaret's chair was empty, untouched, a silent witness to the years that had passed. Harold brushed his hand across its wooden back. He whispered, "You know what to say, Maggie, you always did." He imagined her laughing gently, rolling her eyes at Clara's briskness, then pulling Matthew aside, whispering, "Don't you forget your father's birthday, young man." Margaret had a way of balancing warmth with firmness. She could soften stone with her kindness and still leave her mark like a carving in oak. Harold missed that balance more than anything. The sound of Clara's heels clicking across the floor broke his thoughts. She entered, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a voice sharp with authority. "Yes, 2 rooms. Just make sure the view faces the water. Perfect. We'll be there by 4. She noticed Harold's gaze, smiled faintly, and placed a hand on the suitcase handle. "Oh, Harold, don't forget to check the mail later, okay? Sometimes the postman leaves it on the porch." Harold nodded slowly. Of course, that was it. No mention of celebrating later. No offer to bring him something back. Nothing. Just errands. He sat at the table, his hands resting on the closed card. The silence stretched again, long and awkward, punctuated only by the rustling of Clara's papers and the occasional scrape of Matthew's shoes upstairs. Harold thought of birthdays past, of Matthew at 10, running into the kitchen with a card made of construction paper, glue still tacky, and the words "best dad ever" written in uneven letters. He thought of Margaret's laugh as she tried to keep the frosting from sliding off the cake, of her insistence that Harold close his eyes before blowing out candles. This year, the candles sat unlit. The cake waited in the fridge, and Harold's heart felt like that fridge cold, holding onto something sweet that no one else wanted. At last, Matthew came down carrying a small backpack. His eyes fell on the card in Harold's hands. For a moment his steps slowed. Then with a sigh he forced a smile. "Dad, did you like the card?" Harold looked up at him, his expression gentle. "Yes, son, it was thoughtful." Matthew shifted uncomfortably. We'll celebrate when we get back, okay?" Harold studied his son's face, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes avoided his own. He knew that tone. It was the tone of promises made to ease guilt, not to be kept. He smiled anyway. "Sure, that sounds nice." When Matthew stepped out again, Harold opened the card one last time. This time he noticed something he hadn't before. The inside of the card had faint indentations, as though someone had pressed a pen too hard before writing. Words erased, perhaps, plans crossed out. He traced the lines with his finger. A ghost of a message lingered. "Dinner at 7. Erased, replaced with nothing. It struck him then, not only had he been forgotten, but at some point he had been considered, then deliberately removed. The ache grew heavier. He placed the card back on the counter and whispered, "A wonderful day indeed." The afternoon waned. Outside, children played on bicycles, their laughter spilling into the street. A neighbor carried balloons from her car, preparing for a party. Harold watched from the window, smiling faintly, though the sight twisted something deep inside him. Birthdays belonged to the young now, to families who remembered. Inside, Harold returned to the small cake in the fridge. He opened the door, touched the glass dish gently, and thought, maybe later, maybe I'll still light it even if it's just me. He closed the fridge softly, the hum of the motor filling the silence like a low sigh. And somewhere upstairs, Clara's voice rang out again, firm and dismissive. "Remember, don't tell him. It'll only make it awkward." Harold heard. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. And in that moment, the empty invitation wasn't just a card. It was the truth of his place in the house, present but unnecessary. He sat back down at the table, folded his hands, and let the golden afternoon light wash over him. And though he smiled faintly, the shadow it cast across his face was long and deep. The next morning carried with it the quiet rhythm of departure. The Benson house, usually filled with the smell of coffee or the hum of a radio, instead echoed with the zip of luggage and the clipped tone of Clara's voice as she orchestrated every detail. "Matthew, did you pack the sunscreen?" She called from the hallway. "Yes," came the tired reply. "And the swimsuits, don't forget the charger." Her heels clicked across the floor like a metronome, each sound marking another moment closer to leaving. Harold sat in the living room, reclined in the old leather chair that had molded itself to his frame over decades. The paper lay in his lap unread. His eyes were not on the print but on the open suitcase by the front door. He watched silently, absorbing every detail. The way Clara folded shirts crisply, the way Matthew nodded obediently, the way their excitement filled the air. It was a kind of energy Harold recognized but wasn't part of anymore, like music from a party next door that you can hear but never join. He rose slowly, his joints aching with the effort, and shuffled toward the kitchen. The small strawberry cake waited on the counter, covered neatly with foil. He placed a hand on it as though touching the memory of what could have been. From the kitchen doorway he heard Clara again, her voice low but clear. "I just think it's better if he stays home. He won't enjoy the beach anyway, too much sun for him." There was a pause, then Matthew's sigh. "Clara, it's his birthday." "And he'll be fine," she answered quickly. "He likes his books, his little garden. He doesn't need to come. We'll celebrate when we get back." Her words sliced quietly, efficiently, as if trimming away the unnecessary. And Harold, without intending to, understood that in Clara's eyes he was the unnecessary part. He returned to his chair, the paper still unopened. The walls around him held memories he could almost hear. Margaret humming, Matthew as a boy running down the stairs shouting about fishing trips, the echo of birthday candles being blown out in one joyful breath. Now the walls listened silently, keeping secrets, offering no comfort. Matthew appeared in the doorway carrying a bag. "Dad," he said carefully, "we'll be back tomorrow evening. Don't wait up for us." Harold looked at his son, really looked at him. The lines on Matthew's face were familiar, carved by years Harold had witnessed, but the boy inside, the one who once held his father's hand tightly crossing the street, seemed buried deep beneath adult hesitation and his wife's stern influence. "Don't worry," Harold said with a gentle nod. "I'll be all right." Matthew hesitated, then moved on, the weight of unspoken guilt trailing behind him. Later, as Clara bustled past with her suitcase, she stopped briefly near Harold's chair. Her smile was practiced, polite, like the kind given to a neighbor you barely know. "Enjoy your day, Harold. There's food in the fridge," she said. He nodded once, offering the same gentle smile he had given all morning. "Thank you, Clara. Safe travels." And that was all. When they left the room, Harold's expression shifted. The smile faded, replaced by something quieter, deeper, a loneliness that pressed against his ribs like an old wound reopened. He rose once more, moving slowly to the window. Outside, the car was already packed. He saw Clara adjust the bags in the trunk, Matthew checking his phone. Their voices drifted faintly through the glass, laughter mixed with anticipation. Harold pressed his hand to the window frame, the wood cool beneath his palm. For a fleeting moment, he considered stepping outside, asking to come along, reminding them that today was not just any day. But pride held him still, dignity anchored him in place. Instead, he whispered to the empty room, "It's all right, Maggie. I'll let them go. I'll let them think I don't mind." He turned back toward the kitchen, where the card still lay unopened on the counter, where the cake still waited under its foil, where the house still carried the smell of silence. And in that silence, Harold began to prepare, not a suitcase, not a trip, but something else entirely. A quiet resolve was forming layer by layer, as steady and unseen as roots beneath the soil. The house buzzed with the sound of departure. But Harold's heart, though heavy, was beginning to find its own rhythm, one that would carry him through the days ahead. The Benson house fell into silence once again, but this silence was different from the mornings. It wasn't filled with the bustle of Clara's voice or Matthew's shuffling footsteps. It was a silence that stretched across every room like a blanket too heavy to lift. Harold stood at the doorway, watching through the lace curtains as the car pulled away from the driveway. Clara in the passenger seat, sunglasses perched neatly on her nose. Matthew behind the wheel, eyes fixed forward. They didn't look back, not even once. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving Harold alone in the echo of his own heartbeat. He stayed there longer than necessary, staring at the empty street, until even the dust their car had stirred settled back down. Inside, the house seemed larger now, emptier. He walked through it slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, as if reacquainting himself with an old companion. Every creak of the floor reminded him of years when this home had been alive with voices, with Margaret's laughter, with the squeak of Matthew's sneakers on the stairs. But tonight, there would be none of that. Harold drifted into the kitchen. On the counter, under its foil covering, waited the cake. It wasn't perfect, slightly lopsided, the frosting uneven where his hands had trembled. But it carried the scent of strawberries and sugar, a sweetness that filled the room like a memory. He uncovered it slowly, reverently, as though unveiling something sacred. The sight of it pulled him back to birthdays when Margaret would sing off-key, when Matthew would clap his little hands, when Harold himself would laugh so hard he nearly dropped the knife. Now the cake sat alone, just like him. He set the cake on the table and fetched a single candle from the drawer. It was short, left over from last year, but it would do. He pressed it gently into the center of the sponge, straightening it with careful fingers. Then he struck a match. The flame bloomed small but steady. Its glow filled the dim kitchen, flickering across Harold's lined face. He sat down, folded his hands, and whispered, "Happy birthday, old man." There was no chorus, no clapping, no laughter, only the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. For a moment he thought of making a wish. But what do you wish for when the one thing you want, the presence of those you love, is already out of reach? He leaned forward and blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, twisting and fading into nothing. He watched it go, the way he had watched so many things in life drift away. He cut himself a slice. The knife sank easily into the sponge, the strawberries slipping slightly against the frosting. He placed the slice on a plate, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat down to eat. The first bite was sweet but heavy, sticking in his throat. He chewed slowly, staring at the empty chairs around him. Across from him was Margaret's chair, untouched for years. Beside it, Matthew's, both vacant, both reminders. He imagined their voices filling the room, imagined Clara laughing politely, imagined Matthew leaning back, joking with his father the way he once did. The vision almost fooled him, almost. But when he blinked, the room was empty again. Halfway through his slice, Harold set down his fork. Appetite gave way to something else, the ache of loneliness pressing harder now, unrelenting. He leaned back in his chair, eyes lifting to the ceiling. "Maggie," he whispered, voice breaking. "You'd know what to do, you'd know how to make them see." He closed his eyes. For a brief second he felt her presence, soft as a breeze, steady as an old hymn. He imagined her hand on his shoulder, the way she used to squeeze gently, reminding him that even in silence he was not alone. The ache eased slightly, but only slightly. Evening crept in. The golden light of the day gave way to the cool blues of twilight. Harold stood, covered the cake again, and placed it carefully back in the fridge. The candle stub sat on the counter, a tiny remnant of celebration that never was. He turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly to the living room. There he lowered himself into the recliner, pulling an old blanket over his knees. He stared at the quiet television screen, though he never turned it on. Outside, the world moved on, cars passing, neighbors chatting, a dog barking down the street. Inside, Harold remained still, wrapped not in the comfort of family but in the company of absence. And yet, beneath the heaviness of that night, a spark flickered, not unlike the candle he had blown out earlier. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. It was the spark of a thought, a resolve not yet formed but waiting. For though his birthday had been spent in solitude, Harold knew something. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Morning broke with a pale light that barely colored the Benson house. Harold awoke early, not because he had slept well, but because sleep had been shallow, broken by the creaks of the house and the weight of thoughts pressing against his chest. The kitchen smelled faintly of strawberries from the cake still resting in the fridge. He poured himself coffee, black and thin, and sat at the table with the paper. He opened it, glanced at the headlines, but the words refused to stick. His mind was already elsewhere, waiting for the sound he knew was coming. It didn't take long. Suitcases thudded against the stairs. Clara's voice floated down the hall, sharp, efficient, the way one speaks when managing not just travel plans but people. "Matthew, did you check the boarding passes again? And the charger? I don't want to get halfway there and realize we forgot something." Her words were quick, clipped, echoing in the quiet morning like stones skipping across water. Harold folded the paper slowly, laid it flat, and took another sip of his lukewarm coffee. They entered the kitchen together, dragging luggage behind them. Clara wore a bright sundress, sunglasses perched atop her head though the sun had barely risen. Matthew carried the heavier bags, his shoulders hunched. "Oh, good morning, Harold," Clara said breezily. Her smile was courteous, almost professional, like she was greeting a hotel clerk instead of her father-in-law. "We're heading out now. Don't forget to water the plants, will you?" Matthew shifted awkwardly, then stepped closer. "Dad," his voice faltered. He tried again. "We'll be back tomorrow night. Maybe we can have dinner then." Harold met his son's eyes. For a moment he saw the boy he once knew, the one who had clung to his hand at the county fair, who had cried when Harold left for business trips, who had once promised at age 12, "I'll always celebrate your birthday, Dad." That boy was gone. In his place stood a man pulled by obligations, by marriage, by a life that seemed to have less and less room for his father. Harold's smile was small but steady. "Of course, son. You two have a safe trip." They moved toward the door. Clara lifted a suitcase, then paused and turned back. "We left some leftovers in the fridge for you, chicken and rice. That should be enough until we're back." Her words were brisk, practical, as though she were speaking to a boarder, not family. Harold nodded again. "Thank you." He followed them to the porch, standing in the doorway as Matthew loaded the last bag into the trunk. The car gleamed under the morning sun, polished and impatient to be on the road. Matthew gave his father a quick hug, the kind done out of habit more than desire. Clara offered a small wave, sliding into the passenger seat with practiced ease. "Lock the door behind you, Dad," Matthew said, already slipping into the driver's seat. "I will," Harold replied softly. The engine roared to life. Tires crunched against gravel. The car rolled down the driveway and onto the street. Harold stood at the porch, one hand resting against the wooden frame, watching as the car grew smaller. Neither Matthew nor Clara looked back. The sound of the engine faded, replaced by the hollow stillness of morning. For a long time, Harold remained there, eyes fixed on the spot where the car had disappeared. His birthday had come and gone, marked not by candles and laughter, but by the image of his family driving away without him. He finally turned back inside. The house greeted him with its emptiness. The chairs unoccupied, the air still, the clock ticking too loudly on the wall. In the kitchen, he uncovered the cake once more. The candle stub still lay nearby, its wick blackened from the night before. He placed it beside the card on the counter, a quiet arrangement of things meant for celebration but abandoned halfway. He whispered to the stillness, "Safe travels, Maggie. Our boy is on his way again." The silence gave no answer, but in that silence Harold felt both his deepest wound and the beginning of something else, something harder, sharper. It was not anger, not yet, but it was the seed of resolve, planted quietly in the soil of his solitude. The house, once noisy with footsteps and voices, settled into a stillness so complete that Harold could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the clock, even the soft rush of wind against the window panes. He sat in his recliner, the old leather groaning beneath his weight, and let the silence wrap around him. He had known loneliness before, nights after Margaret passed when the bed felt like an ocean, vast and cold, and he floated on only one side of it. But this loneliness was sharper, not the loneliness of loss, but of being left behind, of being thought unworthy of company. He glanced toward the kitchen. The card, the cake, the stub of a candle blackened and bent, all remnants of a celebration that had never truly begun. And yet, despite the ache, something inside him shifted. It wasn't bitterness, though bitterness would have been easy. It wasn't fury, though fury might have given him momentary strength. No, what filled him now was quieter, steadier. A resolve, the kind that builds not in shouts or anger but in the long, patient silence of a man who has lived through too much to waste his dignity on rage. Harold rose slowly from the recliner. His knees cracked as he stood, but his back straightened with purpose. He walked to the hall closet and pulled out a set of keys, old and slightly tarnished. The keyring felt heavy in his hand, not from weight but from memory. Attached to it was a brass key, long, thin, its grooves worn from decades of use. It was the key to the cabin by the lake, a place Margaret had adored, a place Matthew had spent summers fishing off the dock, a place Harold hadn't visited since grief had chained him to routine. He held the key up, watching how the light caught on its edges. For the first time that day, his lips curled into something close to a smile. He packed a small bag, a few shirts, a pair of jeans, his fishing hat, a notebook, and the framed photograph of Margaret from their 30th anniversary. He placed the picture carefully at the top as if it were the most precious cargo of all. The act of packing steadied him. Each folded shirt, each chosen item, felt like a step toward reclaiming something that had been quietly slipping away. His independence, his peace, his ability to decide for himself. When he finished, he set the bag by the door and returned once more to the kitchen. He cut another slice of cake and ate it slowly, savoring each bite, not because it tasted better, but because he was choosing to eat it for himself, not waiting for others to join. After washing the plate, he took a notepad from the counter and uncapped a pen. The paper trembled slightly beneath his hand as he began to write. It wasn't a letter of anger, nor was it an explanation. It was, instead, a simple statement of truth, written with the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. "Matthew, when you return, you may wonder where I've gone. Don't worry, I'm safe. I've gone back to the cabin by the lake, a place your mother loved and a place I think I need now. Take care of the house. Take care of yourself. And remember, life isn't measured by the trips we take, but by the people we take with us." Dad. He folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the birthday card. By afternoon, Harold stepped out of the house, his small bag in hand, the cabin key tucked safely in his pocket. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows on the driveway where the car had once stood. He locked the door behind him just as Matthew had asked. But when the lock clicked, Harold felt something more than security. It felt like closure, a gentle shutting of one chapter before another could begin. The bus ride to the lake was quiet, winding through fields of tall grass and clusters of pine. Harold sat by the window, watching the world slide by, his reflection overlapping with the blur of trees. He thought of Margaret, of how she used to rest her head against his shoulder on these drives, pointing out every hawk that circled overhead, every deer that darted through the woods. As the bus drew nearer, Harold felt something stirring in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly, but possibility. When the bus finally stopped, he stepped down onto the gravel road. The air smelled of pine and water, crisp and clean, carrying the sound of waves lapping gently against the shore. And there it was, the cabin, weathered, quiet, waiting. Harold stood for a long while, simply looking at it. Then with a deep breath he walked forward, the key warm in his hand, his steps sure, his resolve steady. Inside the small wooden cabin, dust motes floated in the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of cedar and age. Harold set down his bag, placed Margaret's photograph on the mantel, and whispered, "We're home again, Maggie." And as he sat down in the old rocking chair by the window, staring out at the lake's calm surface, he felt something he hadn't in years. Not loneliness, not abandonment, but peace. The quiet resolve had found its place. The days at the cabin passed with a rhythm Harold had almost forgotten. Mornings were spent on the porch, coffee in hand, watching mist lift slowly from the lake. Afternoons found him tending the small garden Margaret had once planted, its rose now overgrown but still alive with stubborn green shoots. Evenings he would sit by the fire with her photograph, telling her about the day as though she were still there, listening with patient eyes. It was a quiet life, but it was his. And in that quiet, Harold began to think clearly again. About Matthew, about Clara, about the house in Willowbrook that had been his pride, built with years of sweat and sacrifice. About the way they had looked through him on his birthday, treating him like a piece of old furniture. And then he thought about the future, not his own, but theirs. One morning, Harold took the bus into town. He wore his best jacket, the one Margaret had always said made him look distinguished. He carried a leather folder under his arm, filled with papers he had pulled from a lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabin. The law office smelled faintly of paper and polish. The receptionist smiled politely, though her eyes widened when Harold gave his name. He had been there before, years ago, when Margaret passed, settling affairs neither of them had ever wanted to face. Now he was here for something different. "Mr. Benson," the lawyer greeted, standing to shake his hand. "It's been a while. What brings you in?" Harold sat down, laying the folder on the desk. His fingers brushed over the papers, lingering for a moment before he opened it. "I'd like to make some changes," he said softly. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. They were clear. Harold owned not just the family house in Willowbrook, but also several parcels of land, savings accumulated over decades, and the cabin itself. It wasn't an empire, but it was enough to matter, enough to change lives. Harold's voice was steady, though his heart beat faster as he spoke. "I want the Willowbrook house transferred to a scholarship fund, in Margaret's name, for children from families who can't afford college." The lawyer raised his brows. "Are you certain, Mr. Benson? That house is worth quite a lot. I recall your son." "Yes," Harold interrupted gently. I know what my son and his wife think, but a home should be more than walls and windows. Margaret believed education could change a life. I'd rather the house do good in her name than sit as a trophy for someone who never valued it. The lawyer studied him, then nodded slowly. And the cabin? Harold smiled faintly. That's mine for as long as I can keep it. A week later, the paperwork was complete. Harold left the office with a lighter step, the folder now containing signed documents that would rewrite the future. For years, his family had assumed everything would pass to Matthew without question. But Harold knew now, inheritance wasn't just about blood. It was about values. It was about teaching one last lesson when words had failed. Back in Willowbrook, the return of Matthew and Clara was anything but triumphant. They burst through the door after their trip, suntanned and cheerful, their laughter carrying up the staircase. Clara dropped her bags, calling out, "Harold, we're back." The house answered only with silence. On the counter, they found the note Harold had left. Matthew read it aloud, his voice faltering. "When you return, you may wonder where I've gone. Don't worry, I'm safe. I've gone back to the cabin by the lake, a place your mother loved and a place I think I need now. Take care of the house. Take care of yourself. And remember, life isn't measured by the trips we take, but by the people we take with us." "Dad," Clara frowned, unimpressed. "Well, at least he's out of our hair for a while." But Matthew wasn't listening. His eyes lingered on the words, heavy with guilt. Something in his father's handwriting felt like a quiet rebuke, sharper than any argument could have been. Days later, another letter arrived, this one from the lawyer. Clara ripped it open eagerly, expecting good news. Instead, her face drained of color as she read. "What is it?" Matthew asked, his voice tight. She thrust the letter at him. He read silently, then aloud. "Mr. Benson has completed the transfer of the Willowbrook property into the Margaret Benson Scholarship Fund, effective immediately. The property is no longer a private inheritance but a charitable trust. Please contact our office if you have questions." The words hit harder than any shout. The house, their house, as Clara had often called it, was no longer theirs. Clara's face twisted. He gave it away to strangers. Matthew sank into a chair, the letter trembling in his hands. His mind swirled with memories, his father building that house board by board, Margaret planting flowers in the front yard, the years of sacrifice that had gone into every brick. And now, instead of being theirs, it would help children they didn't even know. He dropped the letter onto the table. His voice was low, almost breaking. "He's teaching me something even now." At the cabin, Harold sat on the porch, the lake shimmering before him. He held Margaret's photograph in his lap, smiling softly. "They'll be angry," he murmured. "But maybe one day they'll understand. Maybe one day they'll see that family isn't about what we keep for ourselves, but about what we give." The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of earth and water. Harold leaned back in his chair, the weight of years heavy on him, but his heart strangely light. The twist had been made quietly, irrevocably. And though his son and daughter-in-law didn't yet realize it, Harold had just given them the greatest lesson of all. Evenings at the cabin were different. They carried a quiet Harold had come to cherish. The lake reflected the last light of day, orange fading to purple as the pines whispered in the cool breeze. Harold sat on the porch, rocking gently, Margaret's photo propped against the arm of his chair. He thought of Matthew, of Clara, of the look on his son's face when he would finally understand the truth, not just about the house, not just about the scholarship, but about what it meant to honor family. The world often measured love in gifts, in vacations, in things that could be bought or displayed. But Harold knew better. He had learned through years of work, through the joy and sorrow of marriage, through the ache of loss, that love was measured in presence, in remembering, in showing up when it mattered. And on his birthday, when they had chosen not to show up, Harold had been reminded of the value of dignity, his own, and the quiet lesson he still had to teach. A week later, Matthew came to the cabin. He stood awkwardly at the door, suitcase in hand, his shoulders stooped. Harold opened the door, surprised but calm. "Son," he said softly. Matthew's eyes filled before he could speak. He stepped inside, set the suitcase down, and blurted out, "Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I let Clara, I let myself, forget what's important." Harold placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steady, forgiving. "I know," he said. "Sometimes life makes us blind. What matters is whether we learn to see again." Matthew swallowed hard, his voice cracked. "The scholarship, the house, was that really what you wanted?" Harold nodded slowly. "Your mother always believed in giving back. Now her name will live on in something that matters. That's more important than any inheritance." For a long moment, father and son stood in silence, the lake glimmering through the window. Then Matthew whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Harold smiled, lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. "That's what fathers do." That night, as they sat together on the porch, Harold felt Margaret's presence more strongly than ever. The stars above stretched wide and endless, but the moment felt small, intimate, sacred. A man, his son, and the memory of the woman who had held them together. The quiet justice was complete, not through anger, not through punishment, but through love, sacrifice, and a reminder of what family truly means. And so, dear friends, that is the story of Harold Benson. A father left behind on his own birthday, but who found the strength to teach one final lesson. That wealth is not what we hold in our hands, but what we leave in the hearts of others. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with this story. We hope it serves as a reminder of the sacred value of family, of gratitude, and of the quiet strength a father carries. We wish you and your loved ones health, peace, and true happiness. Remember, family love is always the light that guides us, even through the darkest shadows.